My name is Clara. On Christmas night with 20 people watching, my father looked me in the eye and said, "Pay rent or get out." My sister raised her glass, mocking me as the room erupted in uneasy laughter. In that moment, I felt like the child he once slipped love notes into lunchboxes had vanished forever. But the truth is, this betrayal didn't begin at the dinner table. It began years ago when my name was cropped out of family photos, when $24,000 of rent I paid disappeared into his pocket, when my sister used my identity to rack up debts I never made, and when I found the scholarship letter he hid to keep me from leaving. They erased me piece by piece until all I had left was the proof and the choice to finally fight back. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted ham, the kind of scent that should have wrapped me in warmth, but instead it only made my stomach twist. Strings of white lights wound around the banister, the Christmas tree glowed in the corner, and the whole place buzzed with the kind of cheer that felt staged. I carried a tray of roasted vegetables I had spent the afternoon preparing and slipped it onto the buffet table. My hands lingered on the edge for a second, the noise of clinking glasses and booming laughter behind me. For all the sparkle and noise, I might as well have been invisible. My father, Richard Mitchell, sat at the head of the table, his booming voice carrying over the music. He was telling the story of my sister's latest promotion, calling her our pride and joy. Vanessa sat beside him, radiant in her red dress, soaking in every nod of approval. "Director of Marketing at 34, he said, slapping the table like it was the punchline to a great joke. The room erupted in applause. I clapped too weakly, but my hands trembled, and I don't think anyone noticed. I hovered near the kitchen doorway, smiling at guests who brushed past me without recognition, answering polite questions from neighbors who misremembered my name as Clara or Claire. I kept my hands folded, pretending to belong, though the truth was clear. I wasn't part of the story unfolding around that table. My father raised his glass, his cheeks flushed from wine, his voice louder now than the Christmas carols humming in the background. "You know," he said, looking out over the guests, not at me, "there comes a time when a child has to grow up." Something in his tone froze the air. He turned his head, finally meeting my eyes, and with a sharp laugh he declared, "Clara, you're 32 years old. Pay $500 a month in rent or get out of my house." The clatter of forks against plates stopped instantly. The room fell into a stunned silence. I felt every eye pivot toward me, waiting to see if he was joking. But I knew better. My father never joked about money. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine. "Good luck with that," she said, her voice delicate, almost sweet, but the smirk on her face cut like glass. Laughter broke out first, hesitant, then louder until it echoed around me. Some of them didn't even know why they were laughing. They just followed her lead. My throat went dry. I gripped the edge of the tablecloth to keep my hands steady. For a fleeting second, I saw a different version of this man in front of me, the father who used to tuck notes into my lunchbox. "Good luck on your spelling test. You're my girl." That man was gone, replaced by someone who could strip me bare in front of 20 people without a flicker of shame. The heat of humiliation burned across my cheeks. I thought of speaking, of defending myself, of reminding them all that I cooked half the meal they were eating, that I'd been contributing quietly for years. But the words withered in my throat. Instead, I took a slow breath, pushed my chair back, and stood. I reached for my coat hanging on the hook by the door. My movements felt almost ceremonial, the room watching as though this was just another performance for their holiday entertainment. As I slipped one arm into the sleeve, I heard Vanessa whisper just loud enough to carry, "Finally overdue." A ripple of chuckles followed, muted and cruel. I didn't look at her. I didn't look at any of them. The sound of forks picking back up glasses, clinking, and forced laughter returned like the party hadn't skipped a beat. My exit was already being erased. I walked through the living room, past the glowing tree, past the stockings still hanging by the fireplace, and reached for the door. The warmth of the house pressed against my back, the bitter Wisconsin cold seeping in through the crack as I pulled the handle. No one stopped me. No one called my name. The door shut softly behind me, sealing in their laughter, their holiday cheer, their comfortable cruelty. Outside, the night air sliced against my skin, sharp and honest, in a way that the house had never been. My boots crunched in the snow as I stepped off the porch, the glow of the windows at my back, the echoes of their voices fading with each step I took toward the street. I tightened my scarf, shoved my hands into my pockets, and breathed in the freezing air until my lungs ached. My heart was racing, not from the cold, but from the truth that had finally become impossible to ignore. This house had never been mine. And tonight I wasn't going back. Snow sprayed up from the tires as I turned onto a narrow side street, the windshield wipers struggling to keep pace with the storm. My hands were locked tight around the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the leather. Every breath felt jagged, my chest still raw from the words my father had thrown at me only an hour earlier. The world outside was dark, the street lamps glowing halos through the falling flakes, but inside my car the silence was almost deafening. After 20 minutes, I pulled up to a small 2-bedroom house on the edge of Madison's east side, the one I had quietly bought in September, with the money my mother left me in a savings bond. No one knew about it. Not my father, not Vanessa, not even Diane. I had signed the papers in secret, telling myself it was just an investment. But as I parked at the curb, engine idling, I realized it had always been my escape plan, waiting for the night I finally had no choice but to use it. I killed the engine and sat for a long moment staring at the porch light I had left off. The house looked modest, plain, even, but it carried a weight the family home never had. It was mine. I stepped out into the cold, the wind cutting across my face, and trudged through the snow up to the door. My boots left the first footprints across the untouched walkway. Inside, the air was still and faintly smelled of fresh paint. The living room was empty except for a folded blanket on the floor and a cardboard box in the corner. I hadn't unpacked yet, hadn't even bought furniture, but there was a strange comfort in the bareness. No ornaments, no framed photos, no forced laughter, just walls, windows, and silence that belonged to me alone. I hung my coat on a hook by the door and sank down onto the floor. The quiet pressed against my ears, but it didn't feel hostile. It felt clean, like standing in a church long after everyone had left. For the first time that night, I let myself breathe without fear of someone mocking the sound. My eyes drifted to the small tote bag I had thrown into the passenger seat before leaving my father's house. I unzipped it, pulling out the single-wrapped gift I had been handed earlier that evening. The paper was already crumpled as if it had been tossed into a bag at the last minute. I peeled it away, revealing a candle in a chipped glass jar with a clearance sticker still slapped across the bottom, $2.99. The sight of it made my throat tighten. They hadn't forgotten me. They had chosen something cheap, thoughtless, like tossing scraps to a stray dog. It wasn't the price that stung. It was the message. You are worth nothing more than this. I turned it over in my hands, tracing the glue where the price tag clung stubbornly to the glass. A memory broke through the silence. My mother's voice, gentle and certain, the last winter before she died. She had sat me down on the edge of her bed, her hand weak but steady as she pressed a folded note into my palm. "If they ever make you doubt your shine," she whispered, "remember they weren't enough to hold you." I had read those words 100 times since she passed in 2012, each time more like a lifeline. I stood and carried the candle into the kitchen, setting it on the counter under the dim light. My reflection wavered in the window above the sink, pale and exhausted, but my eyes locked onto themselves with something different. Resolve. This wasn't just a useless trinket. It was proof. Proof of how little I mattered to them, and proof that I could no longer deny it. I whispered to the empty room, "This is where it begins." I paced the kitchen slowly, the old hardwood creaking under my boots. Every step felt like drawing a new line in the snow outside, one that could not be erased. My humiliation at that table had been public, cruel, deliberate. But here in this house, their cruelty turned into evidence. The candle, the rent money, the forgotten invitations, the cropped photos. They were no longer just painful memories. They were receipts, and I would not let them vanish. The storm raged harder outside, wind rattling against the windows, but it no longer felt threatening. It sounded like applause, like the city itself was clapping back against the silence of my family's dining room. I pulled the folded blanket around my shoulders and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the candle until its cheap, waxy scent reached my nose. I imagined my father's booming voice announcing Vanessa's accomplishments, the smirk she wore as if she had won some long game I didn't know I was playing. I thought of Diane's soft smile, her attempts to look sympathetic while benefiting from every dollar I paid. My jaw tightened, anger simmering low but steady. They believed they had erased me, that I was too weak to push back. But sitting there in my bare kitchen, I knew better. This was not the end of my story. It was the first page. I reached for my phone on the table, the screen lighting up with the time, 12:47 a.m. No calls, no texts, not even a half-hearted, "Are you okay?" The absence was telling louder than any words they could have spoken. They weren't worried. They weren't curious. They were done with me. Good. I set the phone down face first, stood and walked back to the counter. My fingers curled around the cold glass of the candle, lifting it once more. I carried it carefully to the center of the table and placed it down with purpose, like setting a cornerstone. My pulse steadied as I whispered again, firmer this time, "This is proof. This is where it begins." The snow outside softened the glow of the street lamp through the window, casting a pale halo around the little candle on the table. It didn't look pathetic anymore. It looked like a marker, the first piece of evidence in a case I hadn't realized I'd been building for years. I sat back down, the blanket still around my shoulders, and let the silence of the house cradle me. The humiliation of the evening was still raw, but beneath it was something else, an ember of defiance. As I stared at that clearance sticker, I felt it catch. By the time I closed my eyes, the storm had quieted, the house still bare and empty. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the emptiness. It belonged to me, and so did the fight that was coming. The morning light slipped in through the blinds, thin silver lines cutting across the bare walls. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the candle like it might whisper an answer. But instead of clarity, what came was a flood of old memories, sharp and relentless. I thought of every holiday table where my chair was the one shoved closest to the bathroom door. No matter how early I arrived, no matter how many dishes I cooked by the time we sat down, the only seat left was the one where people brushed past me, constantly mumbling quick apologies as they squeezed through. The smell of hand soap and the sound of the toilet flushing became the background music to every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday. Vanessa always sat in the center, right next to Dad, laughter ringing like she was the hostess of some grand gala. My place was never really a place at all. It wasn't just the chair. It was the name on the place cards, too. Carla one year, Claire the next. Once someone even scribbled C, Mitchell, like I was a stranger they hadn't bothered to learn. I used to convince myself it was careless, just a slip of the pen. But after the third or fourth time, it stopped feeling like a mistake. It felt like a message. The bitterness rose as another memory surfaced. Vanessa's engagement party in the summer of 2019. She had rented out a rustic barn turned event space in Door County, complete with fairy lights and a string quartet. I had stood in the back in a navy dress I bought on clearance, pouring wine into plastic cups, smiling when anyone looked my way. At one point, the lights dimmed and a slideshow began. A cascade of family photos splashed across the wall. Vacations, birthdays, graduations. The crowd oohed and awed, clapping at every tender moment. Then a photo appeared of that summer at Lake Michigan. Dad in his baseball cap. Vanessa wrapped around her fiancé Diane with a glass of wine in her hand. I remembered that day clearly. I was standing right beside them, grinning with the wind in my hair. But in the slideshow, I was gone. Cropped clean out the edge of my arm and a slice of my hair still visible in the corner like a ghost. My chest tightened as the crowd applauded, completely unaware that a person had been erased from the memory. From their memory. The humiliation was quiet, almost polite. No one sneered, no one laughed at me. They just erased me with a few clicks of a mouse and carried on like I had never existed in the first place. That night I went home and stared at my reflection, wondering if anyone would even notice if I stopped showing up altogether. I pulled my laptop closer now and opened the family's shared online album. The folders stretched back years, each labeled neatly by holiday or vacation. I clicked through them, my stomach sinking with every photo. Easter brunch, 2017. Vanessa cutting the ham, Dad beaming. I remembered standing right there with the green beans, but in the photo I wasn't there. 4th of July barbecue, 2018. Neighbors smiling on the lawn. I had been the one who grilled the corn, but there was no trace of me. The captions written by Vanessa read, "Our family or the Mitchells," like I was an afterthought not worth including. I clicked on last Thanksgiving's album. There was a wide shot of the dining room table, everyone smiling at the camera. I remembered the moment vividly because I had set the table, laid out the silverware, and even arranged the centerpiece. In the original photo, I had been standing next to Vanessa, my blouse neatly pressed, my hair curled for once. But in this version, I was gone. The crop was tight, cutting me clean out of the frame. In the comments, people wrote "beautiful family" and "so perfect." No one noticed the missing figure. No one missed her. My throat burned as I scrolled faster, one album after another. It wasn't carelessness. It was a pattern, methodical and deliberate. The kind of erasure that doesn't shout but whispers over years until even you begin to believe you were never there. I closed the laptop with a snap, the sound echoing in the empty kitchen. My fingers clenched into fists on the table. The humiliation I felt at Christmas dinner had been brutal, but it wasn't new. It was just the loudest in a long line of quiet cuts that had been happening for years. The silence of the house wrapped around me again, but this time it didn't soothe. It burned. They hadn't just humiliated me. They had been writing me out of the family story piece by piece, cropping me out until there was nothing left to crop. I leaned back in the chair, my eyes drifting again to the candle on the table. It looked small, pitiful, but it wasn't just a cheap gift. It was evidence, the latest entry in a long catalog of proof. My chest rose and fell as I whispered to myself, "They've been erasing me for years." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. I pressed my palms flat against the table, the wood cool under my skin, and felt the truth settle in my bones. The humiliation wasn't just about that night. It was systematic. It was history. I sat there until the snow outside slowed the glow of the street lamp, softening against the frosted glass. I couldn't undo the photos, couldn't change the captions, couldn't reclaim the chair by the bathroom. But I could refuse to be erased again. The house stayed quiet, holding its breath as if waiting for what I would do next. I powered up my laptop and opened my online banking, the blue glow washing over the kitchen like a spotlight. My fingers hesitated on the keyboard, but curiosity pushed me forward. The account history loaded line by line, month by month, and there they were. Dozens of transfers labeled simply rent. 4 years' worth. Every month, $500 straight into my father's account. $24,000 in total. I leaned closer, my pulse thudding in my ears. Rent. That was the word he had spat at me in front of 20 people, the thing he claimed I wasn't paying. My hands trembled as I clicked deeper. Each transfer was neat, consistent, like proof of a deal I thought I had honored. Something didn't sit right. I remembered once, maybe in 2017, asking if I could just pay the mortgage company directly. My father had laughed, clapped me on the shoulder, and told me not to overcomplicate things. "It's easier this way, Clara. Don't fuss." I had let it go. I always let it go. Now, staring at the screen, I felt the unease claw its way up my throat. I reached for my phone and dialed the number for the mortgage company, the one listed in the old pile of paperwork I kept in a drawer. After a few rings, music crackled through the speaker, a tired piano loop repeating every 40 seconds. My knee bounced under the table as I waited, eyes darting to the candle on the counter like it might steady me. Finally, a woman's voice came on the line. Thank you for holding this, is Nancy. How can I help you today? I swallowed hard. Hi, yes, I need to confirm some information about the property on Westfield Avenue. My name is Clara Mitchell. I used to live there and I just want to check on the account status. There was a pause, the sound of typing on the other end. Ma'am, you're not listed as an account holder. I can't share specifics, but... She hesitated, her tone softening. I can say the account has been delinquent for the last 3 months. The room tilted around me. I gripped the phone tighter. Delinquent. Yes, she said carefully. No payments since September. The line went quiet except for the faint hum of static. My throat felt tight. Thank you, I whispered before hanging up. For a long moment, I sat frozen staring at the laptop screen where my transfers blinked back at me like mocking little receipts. I had been paying faithfully. And yet the bank hadn't seen a dime of it. My father had pocketed the money. I pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the floorboards. Heat flushed through me, a mix of shame and fury. At Christmas dinner, he had looked me in the eye and called me a freeloader, told me to pay rent or get out, all while cashing the checks I had been sending him for years. I thought about the wine he poured freely, the new patio furniture on the deck, the catered meals at every holiday gathering. Paid for with my money. The humiliation I had felt in that dining room twisted into something heavier, something sharper. Betrayal. I stood and paced the kitchen, the wood creaking under each step. My mind ran in circles. $24,000, 4 years of my life, all of it siphoned away under the lie that I wasn't contributing. I yanked open the cabinet where I kept my printer paper, slammed a stack down, and pressed print on the account history. Page after page slid out the dates and amounts crisp in black ink. I stacked them carefully, lined them up square, then clipped them together with shaking hands. The pile felt heavier than it should have. Receipts. Evidence that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined the gaslight flickering around me for years. I grabbed a black marker and wrote in bold letters across the manila folder, "Receipts." The ink bled slightly through the cardboard, dark and permanent. I slid the papers inside, closed the flap, and held it against my chest. For the first time in a long time, I felt the balance shift, however slightly. They could call me dramatic, ungrateful, invisible. But this was proof. The snow tapped softly against the window, the storm easing into a quiet fall. I set the folder down on the counter beside the candle, the two objects side by side like unlikely allies. A clearance bin candle and $24,000 in stolen rent, both telling the same story. I sank into the chair again, staring at the folder, my pulse finally slowing. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache, a small voice whispered that I wasn't powerless. I was collecting a record piece by piece of everything they had tried to bury. The night stretched on silent and still, as the printer light blinked off, and the house settled around me. I pulled the folder closer, resting my hand on it like it was a shield. Whatever came next, I wouldn't walk into it empty-handed. The email subject line glowed at the top of my inbox, urgent credit alert. For a moment, I thought it had to be some kind of spam, but when I clicked it open, my stomach lurched. A new department store card had been opened under my name using my old address on Westfield Avenue, my father's house. I froze my cursor, hovering over the screen, the words blurring. My hands went clammy as I logged into the credit monitoring site I had almost forgotten I still subscribed to. The report loaded slowly, line by line, until the full picture appeared. 2 open accounts, $15,000 in charges, Macy's, Home Goods, Sephora. I scrolled through the transactions, my pulse racing. Designer makeup kits, high-end furniture, a Vitamix blender, and there it was, an $800 hairdryer. A single purchase worth more than I had ever spent on myself in a month. The shipping information sat at the bottom of the screen, mocking me. Recipient Vanessa Mitchell. My chest tightened, a hot wave of nausea rolling through me. My sister, the one who had smirked at me across the Christmas table like she'd won some invisible game, She hadn't just cut me out of photos or mocked me in front of guests. She had stolen my name, my credit, my future. I leaned back in the chair, pressing my hands to my face, trying to steady my breathing. Identity theft. I had heard about it on the news, but never imagined it would come from my own blood. I stood abruptly pacing the kitchen, the wooden floor creaking under each step. Memories flickered back. Vanessa borrowing my ID once in college, just for fun, her using my student discount without asking, the way she used to shrug and say, "You don't mind, right? You never use it anyway." Back then it was small, annoying, but harmless. Now it was a felony. I grabbed my phone and scrolled to her contact, my thumb hovering over the call button. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to hear her stutter. But I knew how that would go. She'd laugh, she'd twist it, she'd make me sound hysterical. My father would back her. Diane would soften her voice and say I was overreacting. Instead, I opened my email and began to type. Vanessa, I'm aware of the accounts opened under my name and the charges you've made. If another transaction appears, I will report everything to the police, the bank, and the FTC. This is your only warning. My fingers hovered, then I hit send. A thin thrill of control ran through me, even as fear tightened my chest. The kitchen felt colder suddenly. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders, staring at the candle on the counter. The clearance sticker stared back at me like a joke. That had been my Christmas gift. Meanwhile, she was using my credit to buy luxury beauty products. The anger rose hot and steady. She thought I would stay quiet, that I'd never push back. She thought I was still the girl sitting at the bathroom chair, smiling through interruptions, happy to be cropped out. Not anymore. I sat down again, pulling my laptop closer, and began downloading the full report, page after page of transactions. The numbers blurred, but I forced myself to keep going, naming the folder Fraud. I printed the first few pages, the paper sliding warm into my hand. The weight of it was real, undeniable. I laid the sheets side by side on the table, each line a record of betrayal. $15,000. My name. Her indulgence. I thought about the years I had scraped to cover bills, the nights I'd picked up extra shifts at the clinic, just to have enough for gas and groceries. And all the while she had been swiping cards in my name, living it up while I pinched pennies. My phone buzzed suddenly. A new email. Read receipt, Vanessa Mitchell. She had opened it. No reply yet, just that cold notification. She knew I knew. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, waiting for some response. An excuse, a denial, anything. But nothing came. Just silence. I closed the laptop with a snap, the sound ringing through the empty kitchen. My hands shook, not from fear anymore, but from fury. They had used me for years, drained me dry, erased me from the story. Now, with one careless slip, Vanessa had handed me the proof. The snow outside fell heavier, muffling the world. I sat alone in the glow of the streetlight, filtering through the blinds, the folder of fraud spreading across the table, and whispered into the quiet. This is just the beginning. The first call came just after sunrise, the shrill buzz of my phone cutting through the stillness of the house. I let it ring until it went silent, then vibrate again. The third time I flipped it over on the counter and watched Richard's name flash across the screen. My thumb hovered for a second before I let it go to voicemail. His voice played back moments later, gruff and commanding, even through the tinny speaker. "You're making a fool of yourself, Clara. You're making this family look bad. Call me back before this gets uglier than it already is." I pressed delete before he finished. The group chat lit up soon after. Vanessa's name popped up, her tone as casual as if she were asking me to pick up milk from the store. "Wi-Fi's down, fix it." The audacity of it made me laugh out loud, the sound sharp in the empty kitchen. For years I had been the one who kept the house running, the bills, the car insurance, the internet. They leaned on me, mocked me, and then leaned on me again. My fingers flew across the screen. "I'm handling my own life now, just like you said." I hit send and tossed the phone back on the counter. I opened my laptop, pulled up my accounts, and began the slow process of severing every last tie. First was the internet bill. I clicked through the profile page, changed the login, and hit cancel on autopay. The screen asked me to confirm. I clicked yes. A wave of quiet satisfaction rolled over me. Next came the car insurance. Richard had insisted years ago that it was easier to keep the policy in my name since I was better with computers. Easier for him, maybe. I logged in, removed my information, and closed it down. The list grew electric gas water. Each account had my name tied to it, each one a shackle disguised as responsibility. One by one, I unhooked myself. The confirmations piled into my inbox, sterile and impersonal, but to me they read like small victories. My phone buzzed again. Richard this time, then Diane. The voicemail from her was softer, but no less manipulative. "Honey, don't do this. You know your father didn't mean what he said last night. We were all tired. Let's talk it through." I deleted that one too. Another message from Vanessa popped up in the chat. "Hello. Still waiting. Mom can't even watch her shows. This is ridiculous. No acknowledgement of what happened at dinner, no apology, not even the decency to pretend she cared. Just entitlement, pure and simple." I sat back, arms crossed, and watched the screen fill with little red notification dots. The calls came faster now, one after another, until the phone vibrated across the counter like it was trying to escape. Missed calls stacked into dozens, then more. Texts piled in, half angry, half panicked. "Call us back. You're being dramatic. Your dad's furious. What are you doing? Turn the Wi-Fi back on." I stared at the flood of messages, the desperation laced with arrogance. For years, I had been the one scrambling to keep things running, the one fixing their messes before they even noticed there was a problem. Now, with a few clicks, I had left them in the dark. A laugh bubbled up, cold and bitter, but real. For the first time, the power wasn't in their voices or their demands. It was in my silence. The phone rattled against the wood again, buzzing until the sound blurred into the hum of the fridge. I picked it up finally, not to answer, but to turn the ringer off completely. The screen flashed with the sheer volume of attempts. 28 missed calls, 15 unread texts, and counting. I set it face down, the vibration still pulsing against the counter, and leaned back in my chair. The house around me was quiet, unbothered, peaceful. Their panic couldn't reach me here. I closed my eyes, let the faint hum of the radiator fill the silence, and allowed myself a thin, cold smile. For once, I wasn't the one running to fix everything. For once, they were the ones scrambling. And I wasn't lifting a finger. The knock at the door startled me. I had been sitting at the kitchen table with the receipts folder open in front of me, the steady buzz of unanswered calls still lighting up my phone. I hesitated, wondering if it might be one of them, but when I peeked through the frosted glass, I saw a familiar figure bundled in a long wool coat. Aunt Margaret. I opened the door, the cold rushing in with her. She stepped inside quickly, brushing snow from her scarf. Her eyes looked red either from the wind or from something heavier. "Clara," she said softly, placing a gloved hand on my arm. "I don't want to stay long. I needed to bring you this." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive in a white envelope. Her hand trembled slightly as she handed it to me. "You should hear it for yourself." I frowned, confused, but led her into the kitchen. We sat across from one another at the bare table. She didn't take off her coat, didn't even glance around the empty house. Her focus was on me, her expression heavy. "What is it?" I asked, my voice lower than I meant it to be. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's from Vanessa's engagement party. Someone recorded part of the night on their phone. I thought you should have a copy before it disappears." My heart pounded as I slid the USB into my laptop. A file popped up, grainy video footage with muffled music in the background. The camera wobbled between faces, laughter, clinking glasses. And then I heard Vanessa's voice clear as day. "Clara. She's not really part of this. She's more like the emergency fund. You know, the backup bank account. We keep her close just in case." The laughter that followed was unmistakable. Vanessa's sharp giggle, then my father's booming chuckle layered on top. She doesn't mind, he added, his glass clinking against hers. She's used to it. The sound of it punched through me sharp and merciless. My hands shot to my mouth, but the tears spilled through anyway. It was worse than I imagined, not just because of the words, but because of how casually they said them. Like it wasn't even cruel, just fact. I sat, frozen tears sliding down my face, the screen glowing in the dark kitchen. Aunt Margaret reached across the table, her hand warm on mine. "You're not imagining it, Clara. You never were. They did this to you. And they'll keep doing it if you let them." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. When she finally stood to leave, she kissed my cheek, her voice steady but sad. "Your mother would be proud. Don't let them erase you." After the door closed and her car pulled away, the silence in the house pressed in again. I turned back to the laptop, hit play, and let the recording roll once more. Vanessa's words cut deep, the emergency fund. My father's laugh followed, sealing the betrayal. I hit replay again and again. Each time the sting shifted. The first time it broke me. The second time it enraged me. By the third, it started to harden into something else. Resolve. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve and leaned closer to the screen. "You wanted proof," I whispered to myself. "Here it is." I saved the file into the growing folder on my desktop, labeling it in bold letters, "Audio." My fingers hovered for a moment before I clicked save. The folder was filling with fragments of truth. Receipts, credit reports, now a recording. Each one a nail in the coffin of their lies. I sat back, exhaustion flooding me, but beneath it was a steady current of strength. For years they had convinced me I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too forgettable. Tonight I had proof that I wasn't any of those things. I was right. I pressed play once more, listening to their voices echo through the empty kitchen. This time I didn't cry. I let the sound wash over me like steel hardening in fire, and I whispered to the dark, "You won't laugh about me again." I dragged the last unopened box across the floor, dust rising in the pale morning light. My knees ached as I pried at the brittle tape with my fingernail, the cardboard giving way with a crack. Inside, the past spilled out in layers. Old yearbooks, ribbons from track meets, yellowed birthday cards. The scent of paper and time hit me sweet and sour all at once. At the bottom, wedged between a worn copy of my high school diploma and a stack of college brochures, was a manila envelope. My name was scribbled across the front in black ink, sharp and rushed. I pulled it free, my fingers trembling before I even knew why. I slid out the letter, the university crest catching the light. Northwestern University. My eyes darted across the page, heart pounding faster with every line. "We are pleased to offer you a full scholarship. Tuition, housing, books." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. It was everything I had ever wanted, a door I never knew had been opened to me. I flipped the envelope over and there it was. My father's handwriting scrawled in the margin. "We can't let her leave, she's too important here." The breath left my body in a single, jagged exhale. I sank to the floor, the paper crumpling in my hands as a sob ripped through me. The sound echoed off the bare walls, raw and unrestrained. 12 years. 12 years of my life rerouted not by chance, not by fate, but by a decision my father had made without me. He had stolen my future and called it family. I curled forward, clutching the letter to my chest, the tears hot and unrelenting. Images flashed through my mind. The night shifts at the diner to pay for community college classes. The shame of dropping out when I couldn't afford the bills, the way Vanessa would sneer, "Guess college wasn't for everyone." All the while the scholarship had been sitting here, hidden, buried, like I didn't deserve to know. The grief was suffocating. I rocked back and forth on the hardwood floor, my sobs breaking into the still air until I was empty, my throat raw, my body trembling. For a moment I thought I might never get back up, but then through the blur of tears I saw the folder on the table. Receipts, fraud, audio. My growing arsenal of truth. Slowly, shakily, I pushed myself upright. My legs wobbled as I carried the letter to the table and laid it gently beside the others. My hands lingered on the paper, smoothing the creases I had made when I first clutched it in despair. "This goes with the rest," I whispered, my voice hoarse but steady. I stared at the words scrawled on the back of the envelope again. We can't let her leave. The arrogance, the control, the certainty that I would never fight back. My father had thought he could steal my future without consequence. For 12 years, he had been right. Not anymore. I slid the scholarship letter into a clear sleeve and added it to the binder I had started, labeling the tab in thick black ink, "Stolen Future." The marker squeaked against the plastic, final and damning. I sat back in the chair, the binder heavy in front of me, and wiped the last streak of tears from my cheeks. My chest still ached, but beneath the pain was something new, a pulse of defiance. They had humiliated me, erased me, stolen from me, silenced me. And now I had proof of every single betrayal. I closed the binder with a firm snap, the sound sharp in the quiet house, and for the first time since opening that box, I felt my breathing even out. My eyes lingered on the stack of evidence. Each page was a wound, but together they were a weapon. I reached for the candle still sitting at the center of the table, its clearance sticker peeling at the edges, and set it next to the binder. 2 symbols of the same truth they had tried to cheapen me, erase me, control me. But here, under my roof, the narrative was no longer theirs to write. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, and let the silence of the house settle around me. The weight of 12 stolen years pressed heavy on my shoulders, but I wasn't crumbling anymore. I was standing, and I wasn't going to stop. I parked at the curb of Westfield Avenue, my old street, and sat for a long moment, staring at the house I had once called home. The Christmas wreath still hung on the door, its red ribbon now wilted from the cold. The same cracked driveway, the same porch light I used to replace every fall, the same windows where I once saw my mother waving goodbye before school. The place looked unchanged, but I wasn't the same person who had walked out of it on Christmas night. The envelope on the passenger seat felt heavy against my thigh. 3 of them, actually. Each one filled with the evidence I had collected: bank statements, the audio file transcript, the stolen scholarship letter. My hands trembled as I picked them up, not from fear this time, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I opened the car door, the cold air rushing in sharp and clean, and walked up the path I had shoveled 100 times before. My boots crunched over the snow, each step deliberate. I didn't knock. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell of pot roast filled the kitchen. Diane stood at the stove, wooden spoon in her hand, her posture stiffening the moment she saw me. Richard sat at the table, a sandwich half finished in front of him, his jaw tightening. Vanessa leaned against the counter, scrolling her phone, her red nails clicking against the screen. No one spoke. I walked to the table, set the 3 envelopes down in the center, and slid them across the wood until they rested between them. My voice was steady. Inside are bank statements, a recording, and a letter from Northwestern. You'll want to read them carefully. Richard's eyes flickered to the envelopes, but he didn't move. Vanessa gave a short, humorless laugh. What is this supposed to be? Some kind of show-and-tell god, Clara? You always make yourself the victim. I met her gaze, unblinking. I'm not a victim. I'm a witness, and those are the receipts. Her smirk faltered for a second, but she recovered quickly, tossing her hair over her shoulder. You really think anyone's going to believe you? You've always been fragile, overly dramatic. People know what you're like. People will hear your own words, I said evenly. From your engagement party, about me being the emergency fund. They'll hear Dad laughing about it, and they'll see the scholarship letter he hid. That's not me being fragile. That's the truth. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard shifted in his chair, his jaw working, but no sound coming out. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the envelopes, as if they might burn him. Diane set the spoon down and stepped forward, her face soft, her arms opening like she might embrace me. Honey, please, let's not do this. We're family. We can fix it. I stepped back, my voice sharp. No more hugs from people who steal from me. She froze, arms dropping to her sides, lips parting like she wanted to cry but couldn't summon the tears. I turned toward the door, my boots loud against the hardwood. The weight in my chest shifted as I reached for the handle. For years, I had walked out of this house, carrying shame, anger, silence. This time, I left it behind. The door clicked shut behind me, and the house that had taken so much from me was quiet at last. The manila binder felt heavier than it should as I carried it through the glass doors of Grant & Associates. The receptionist gave me a polite smile before leading me down a hallway lined with framed certificates. My palms were damp against the folder, but my steps stayed steady. Samuel Grant rose from behind his desk when I entered. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, his handshake firm but not overbearing. Clara Mitchell. He asked, his tone calm, professional. Yes. My voice came out steady, though my chest was tight. I slid the binder onto his desk. Everything's in here. He opened it carefully, flipping through the tabs I had labeled. Receipts. Fraud audio, stolen future. The pages whispered under his fingers as he paused here and there, nodding slowly. Mariam, you've done most of the work already, he murmured almost to himself. This is thorough. I sat stiffly across from him, twisting my fingers in my lap. I just need to know what can actually be done. I'm tired of being called a liar in my own family. He looked up, his eyes sharp. First step, we file reports with the FTC and the credit bureaus to flag the fraud. That stops them from opening any more accounts under your name. Then we notify the bank and the local police. With the audio and the paper trail, you have a strong case. The words landed like a lifeline. For years I had felt powerless, erased, unheard. Now here was someone telling me my evidence mattered. I nodded, swallowing hard. Do it. For the next hour, we went through each document, Samuel dictating details while his assistant typed notes. The more we cataloged, the steadier my breathing became. By the time I left his office, the binder was lighter, a copy of my own defiance, left in capable hands. Outside, the winter sun was pale but bright. I pulled my coat tighter around me and exhaled into the crisp air. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving their cruelty. I was fighting back with the law behind me. Word spread faster than I expected. Within a week, whispers were running through the neighborhood. Richard Mitchell under investigation for financial misconduct. Vanessa Mitchell facing questions at her marketing firm after someone anonymously forwarded the fraud report to HR. I didn't ask who did it, but I had a guess. Aunt Margaret had always been quiet but never blind. On my way to the grocery store, I saw Richard at the gas station. His posture, once so straight and commanding, was slumped. He kept his eyes on the ground as he pumped his gas, the man who used to command rooms now shrinking into the background. He glanced up once, met my eyes across the lot, and immediately looked away. For years, I had walked with my head down while he laughed at my expense. Now it was his turn to lower his gaze. 2 days later, I passed by Vanessa downtown. She was usually impossible to miss, striding in heels, her voice carrying across the street. But that morning she hurried along the sidewalk, sunglasses hiding her face though the sky was gray. 2 co-workers flanked her, whispering behind their hands. She didn't notice me at first, but when she did, her jaw tightened and she pulled her coat tighter, hurrying away without a word. I stood there watching her retreat, my heart steady. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to gloat. Karma had arrived on its own, quiet but undeniable. Back in my car, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The silence in the cabin was thick, but it wasn't the silence of erasure anymore. It was the silence of balance being restored. I drove past my old street once more, the house looming with its sagging porch and tired wreath. I saw a neighbor pause in the yard across the way, turning to watch Richard shovel snow alone. They didn't wave. They didn't call out. The same neighbors who used to crowd his Christmas parties now crossed the street when he appeared. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, not out of anger, but out of awe. The mighty Mitchell image, the one they had polished for years while pushing me into the shadows, was crumbling without me lifting a finger. That night, I sat at my own kitchen table, the candle still in its place beside the binder of evidence. I watched its wick flicker low, the flame steady in the dark. My father's voice echoed in my memory. Pay rent or get out. And I almost laughed. I had paid more than he ever knew. And now the truth was paying him back in silence he couldn't control. I leaned back in my chair, the quiet of the house wrapping around me like armor, and let the moment settle. For once, justice didn't come with shouting or revenge. It came with heads bowed, voices hushed, and the knowledge that they could no longer laugh at me without choking on the truth. The steady beep of monitors and the shuffle of nurses' shoes against linoleum had become my new soundtrack. I poured myself into the work at St. Mary's Hospital, throwing my energy into long shifts, charting patient notes, and assisting wherever I was needed. For the first time in years, my focus was entirely on me and the people I served, not on keeping a crumbling household afloat. One afternoon, after finishing a particularly busy shift, my supervisor, Linda Harris, called me into her office. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes, softened by kindness, the kind of leader who didn't waste words. She gestured for me to sit. "Clara," she said, sliding a performance report across the desk, "you're doing excellent work here. The patients love you, the staff relies on you. Have you ever considered further training, nursing school, maybe even a degree that would let you step into leadership?" The words caught me off guard. For so long I'd been told I wasn't enough. Too sensitive, too fragile, too much trouble. Hearing someone not only see my effort, but value it, made something swell in my chest. I've thought about it. I admitted, my voice soft. "You should," Linda said firmly. "You have the instincts. Don't waste them." I nodded, blinking back a rush of emotion. "Thank you," I whispered, meaning it. That night, walking back into my quiet house, I felt the silence differently. It wasn't empty anymore. It was possibility. A few days later, my neighbor Carol Evans knocked on my door with a flyer in her hand. She was in her 60s, warm and chatty, the kind of woman who baked pies for everyone on the block. "We're putting together a winter coat drive for families in need," she explained, her smile genuine. "I know you're new around here, but would you like to help out?" For a moment, I hesitated. Community had always meant obligation in my old life. Chores, duties, endless sacrifices. But Carol's eyes held no judgment, only invitation. "Yes," I said finally. "I'd love to." The following Saturday, I found myself in the church basement sorting coats into neat piles alongside volunteers who laughed and shared stories. No one asked me about my family. No one expected me to prove my worth. For the first time, I felt like I belonged simply by being present. Later that evening, as I sipped tea by the window, my phone buzzed. A text lit up the screen from a number I hadn't seen in years. "Clara, it's Daniel. I heard what happened. Just wanted you to know, I'm proud of you. You always deserved better." Daniel Brooks. My chest tightened as his name filled the screen. He had been my boyfriend in college, kind and steady, the one person who had once believed in me without question. We had broken up not because of us, but because of them. My father's constant interference, Vanessa's whispers, Diane's subtle digs about how he wasn't good enough for the Mitchells. They had poisoned something that might have lasted. I typed and erased a dozen responses before finally settling on "Thank you, Daniel. That means more than you know." He replied with nothing more than a heart emoji, simple and clean. I stared at it for a long time, realizing I didn't feel the ache of loss anymore. I didn't want to go back. I didn't need to. I had finally stepped out of their shadow, and that freedom mattered more than any rekindled romance. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, a blank application form glowing on the screen. It wasn't for nursing school, not yet. Instead, it was for a real estate licensing course. Over the past weeks, the idea had taken root and grown. I had learned more than I ever wanted to about mortgages, deeds, and financial exploitation. Maybe I could use that knowledge to help others, especially women like me who had been trapped by families who abused their trust. As I filled out the form, my heart raced. Each keystroke felt like a declaration. Name, address, payment, submit. When the confirmation email arrived seconds later, I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just a class. It was a door opening a path toward something bigger than survival. An idea began to form, fragile, but persistent. What if I created an organization dedicated to helping women reclaim their independence after financial abuse? Workshops on credit repair, legal resources support networks. I even had a name for it already echoing in my mind, Unwritten Her. I scribbled it in my notebook, circling it twice. The words looked right strong yet tender. I glanced at the candle on the counter, the clearance sticker still half peeling. Once it had symbolized my humiliation. Now it was just another piece of evidence proof of how far I had come. I didn't need their table anymore, their approval, their applause. I had my own, and for the first time the future didn't feel stolen. It felt wide open. The wind off Lake Michigan was sharp enough to sting, but I welcomed it. I pulled my coat tighter around me and sat on the old wooden bench near the shoreline, the same spot my mother used to bring me when I was little. The lake stretched out gray and endless chunks of ice floating near the shore, the sky above a pale slate just before dawn. In my hands, folded and worn soft at the edges, was her letter. I had read it so many times I could have recited it word for word, but today I read it one last time. If they ever make you doubt your shine, remember they weren't enough to hold you. My throat tightened as I whispered it under my breath. I struck a match, shielding the flame from the wind, and touched it to the edge of the paper. The fire caught quickly, curling the corners black before racing across the page. I held it steady until the heat licked my fingers, then let it go. The ashes scattered into the air, carried across the frozen surface of the lake, pieces of her handwriting dissolving into the morning sky. I sat there watching until the last ember disappeared. The grief was still there, but it felt different. Lighter, not like a chain, but like a scar. Something I could carry without breaking. The snow under my boots crunched as I stood, and I looked back once at the bench before turning toward the path. The first day of the new year stretched out in front of me, blank and silent, the kind of silence that didn't demand I disappear, but invited me to breathe. When I reached home, the light had shifted brighter now, the world covered in white. I made coffee, wrapped myself in my thick cardigan, and opened my journal. On the first page of the year, I wrote slowly, carefully, "I release you," not as a gift to them, but as a promise to myself. The ink bled slightly into the paper, permanent. I closed the book and set it beside the candle on the counter. The sticker was still half attached, the $2.99 glaring back at me, but I didn't feel the sting anymore. It was just an object now stripped of its power. I had taken that back. Later that morning, I walked through the neighborhood, the air crisp, the sidewalks freshly shoveled. Carol Evans waved from her porch, calling out a cheerful, "Happy New Year!" I smiled and waved back. For the first time, I felt like those words belonged to me. I paused at the corner store to pick up a notebook for my real estate course. At the register, 2 women whispered behind me, their voices low but clear enough to catch. "Did you hear about the Mitchells? He's being investigated and she's in trouble at her job." Credit card fraud. Can you imagine? I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The words washed over me, not as triumph, but as confirmation. Their downfall wasn't my doing. It was the truth catching up. That afternoon, I sat at my desk with the course materials, open highlighter in hand. I took notes, the kind of careful, deliberate notes I used to dream of taking in a college classroom. My future was here waiting for me, and I was finally the one writing it. When evening came, I pulled on my boots and went for another walk. The lake was quieter now, the wind softer. I stopped at the edge of the water and watched the snowflakes drift lazily down, melting as they touched the surface. My breath clouded in the air, steady and sure. For years I had been told I was too much, too dramatic, too fragile. They had erased me from photos, from conversations, from their version of history. But standing there on the shore, I knew the truth. I wasn't too much. I was enough. And they would never be able to take that from me again. I turned back toward the path, my footprints marking a clear line through the fresh snow. I didn't look over my shoulder. For the first time, there was nothing behind me worth turning back for. Voiceover. Have you ever had to walk away from family to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice might be the light someone else needs to see.